Memories are interesting things, aren't they? First thing that I can remember in my life was about 3 years of age when I foolishly filled up a Coke bottle, a glass one, with damp sand, and then in trying to get that sand out, I smashed the bottle and cut my hand. I still bear the scar. In the same year when I was 3, and it shows you that I wasn't very bright from the very beginning, I decided to be like my brother, who was pretending to be a snorkeler, and he had actually flippers and a snorkel. I just got the little cricket bat with a wooden handle and shoved it into my mouth and dived into the grass off about a half-metre height. It took the handle, ripped the top of my mouth out. I almost died. I'm sure it spoiled a brilliant career in opera singing, but I don't know that for a fact. So things to start with are a little bit rocky. My mother said that I gave her every grey hair, which is a bit disturbing considering for the last couple of decades she's been completely white. My life after that was pretty good up until I was 12, and then I had a whole year of quite ill health, where at one stage I suffered from a condition, spent a couple of months in hospital and almost lost my leg. After that, things were great. But it is interesting, brothers and sisters, that as you go through life's experiences, the scriptures help you on that journey. So although my life was pretty good, the reality is that we all do face challenges at times. And Jared thanked me for sending across the hymns and told him what the theme was, and we're going to use Psalm 77. And it sounded like, I was diligent in doing that. But the fact is that 17 years ago, I exhorted on this particular psalm. And up until then, in reality, most of the things that were in the psalm were academic to me. But I wanted to find out what this psalm was all about, because I was surrounded by people very close to me that were suffering a range of various things and challenges, including mental health and quite severe. So I needed to know what the comfort of the scriptures was. I guess, in conclusion, the Psalm 77 has become very, very important in my life since then, and it's no longer an academic thing with me, and I lean on this chapter, and I'm hoping that this morning I'm able to convey in some way to you the power of this record, so that if things get thrown your way out of left field, that you are able to gain the strength from the word of God as seen through the eyes of the psalmist here. And it's interesting because the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 says these words, "There hath no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted or tested above that you're able, but will, with the temptation or the test, also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it." And if you don't read to the very end of that particular verse, you can draw a very wrong conclusion. And that is that God is always there to let us escape, and therefore the trials and temptations and difficulties and challenges and the sufferings of this life, are just simply sort of done away with, so that we just go through life unscathed with those things. But that's not what the Apostle Paul is saying there, is he? He's saying that the difficulties and the tests and the suffering and the struggles that we can go through, whether that's a whole range of things in life, that those difficulties there are to mould us, and God is going to help us to bear that, to endure that. And so really the lesson out of this particular psalm is that. Now I'm sure that when Jesse read that for us, you would have noticed certain things here. Okay? For instance, at the very beginning, before you might have glanced up to see that we don't know who the writer really is. He's just declared as a son of Asaph. And then when we get into it, and there's no date therefore for this, so it's a general psalm that can apply to anybody at any time in our life. And I think that's quite important. And then in the first 3 verses there, we see that there's an unspecified problem. And I think that's also really helpful. We're not told there. We know it's incredibly serious, right, in this person, in this psalmist's life. But we don't know whether it's external to him or whether it's internal. We don't know whether or not it's mental health, okay, which of course is ravaging our world at the moment. We don't know whether it's physical ill health. We don't know whether it's family matters, financial difficulties. We don't know what it is. So this particular psalm, in many ways, can help us in whatever situation we fall into. We do know, however, when we look at verse 2, that it's tearing him apart. Notice that it says there at the very end, my soul refused to be comforted. It's interesting that the psalmist should use the word soul, because in that sense it's talking about his whole being, isn't it? So here, it may have been a physical ailment, but it's affecting him emotionally and mentally, and as we read through the psalm, spiritually. He has been incredibly challenged here by these circumstances. In verse 3 he says it's overwhelming his spirit. So it's affecting his attitude and his motivation. And I just pause there and let you, think yourself about whether this has been applicable in your life thus far. Have there been times when you've been like in the pit, okay, in that dark place, okay? And we'll use the modern expression, whether the black dog is, ruling your life. Well, if you haven't been there yet, and I look out amongst some of the young ones and think that perhaps that's not the case, then I can assure you that this psalm at some point in your life, or on many times in your life, will become very, very helpful. We are talking about a very faithful brother in the truth here. We're not talking about someone who's, not there in his mind when he's worshipping God. And he's tried everything that that has worked in the past in this situation. He's tried it again. It's just not working. So notice in verse 1, he's prayed to his God. He's felt in the past that God's heard him. That's been his experience. But it's not working now. You read on into verse 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and you find that he's meditating upon the word of God. So he hasn't not done those things. And his previous experience has obviously been very positive, but on this occasion, something's not working. If you jump across to verse 11, and I think it's important, and I'm sure when Jesse was reading, you also pick this up, but let's think about verse and read verse 11 and 12 perhaps. It says, I will remember the works of Yahweh. Surely I will remember thy wonders of old. I will meditate also of all thy work and talk of thy doings. And then he goes into this, almost extended doxology in verses 13 on, where he's praising God for the wonderful things that God has done for the nation in the past. And quite evidently, brothers and sisters, he's then applying that in his own life. And 17 years ago, for the sake of others, I guess, in some ways, I really wanted to know what had changed from the first 9 verses to get him to this positive state of mind. I really needed to know that. I guess so that, perhaps in some way I could help those in terrible pain, to help them in that journey, in that difficulty. Yet, as we'll see when we get to verse 10, of course, was shrouded in, obscure Hebrew. So it wasn't easy to work out. And I think that in many ways that's life as well, isn't it? And if I'm speaking right now and I'm thinking of, Steve's long list of people, that are, watching in, listening in, and of course our Sister Marilyn, who's, perhaps this psalm is really needed for her. I will say that sometimes in talking to people who are in that pit, that they struggle to sort of see this. So really, I think God has been very gracious to give us these words sometimes before we're there, so that we can apply them during that experience. In other words, he's prefaced our problems and given us some sort of anchor during that particular time. But we know, if we go back to verse 4, that the results of this situation, this problem, whatever it was, it's sleeplessness. And I'm not going to ask you to put your hand up for those who perhaps suffer from depression or anxiety. And over the last 17 years, I can raise my hand. So Psalm 77, as I say, became very, very important for me. It causes sleeplessness, isolation, and withdrawal. That's his experience, the psalmist's experience here. And I'm going to use this, and I hope those people who are listening can also see, because it's hard to describe a spiral, isn't it, without going like this. But it's like a funnel, isn't it? And it gets faster and faster and more intense as it gets down to the pointy end. But really that's what the psalmist is saying here in verse 5. I've considered the days of old, the years of ancient. I call to remembrance my song in the night. I commune with mine own heart, and my spirit made diligent search. And you can almost, I can feel it. Okay, those long hours at night. Now, I'm going to say something right now about my experience when I visited you last. And this is going to make Mike and Ruth squirm a little bit. But, when we were here last, we had a delightful meal with about 10 of us afterwards at Mike and Ruth's place. And within the week, I was in the Royal Adelaide Hospital for a whole week with acute pancreatitis. Poor old Ruth was going through conniptions trying to work out what she fed me, that caused this terrible situation. I assure you it was nothing that I ate, okay, I think. They never could find out what the problem was, but it was a week of intense pain. And I've had pain, I'm rather good with pain, and I actually suffer from a condition that's nicknamed the suicide disease. So it's all right, it's under control, don't be worried. But this particular pain was something else. And so the nights in the Royal Adelaide Hospital, as lovely as a hospital as that is, it's like a resort. Pity you have to be so sick to be there. The nights are so long. And I mean it personally. Again, Psalm 77 became very important and what the answer really was. Notice where his mind, the psalmist, goes in verses 7 to 9. Have you ever been in a situation where you're asking questions of God? Questions that, being the English teacher, rhetorical question, okay, questions that don't seem to have an answer. Look, just we'll read that again, those verses again, and just feel the despair that's crept into this man's life. Will the Lord cast off forever? And will he be favourable no more? Is his mercy clean gone forever? Doth his promise fail forevermore? Hath God forgotten to be gracious? Hath he in anger shut up his tender mercies? Selah, consider that. Boy, is he being honest here, that in the darkness of long nights of sleeplessness, that he actually dared to ask those questions. You can understand why I wanted to know what the answer was. How to go from that at the depth of the pit to the wonderful declarations how great God is in the latter verses of this psalm. Are you interested in what the answer was? I certainly was. And the reality is, and I was helped on the journey because I'd studied Psalm 77, and before I gave the exhortation, thankfully, I went to see a dear friend, Brother Gary Steele, and we sat down and actually went through the psalm in quite some detail. And Gary, who was actually going to do a talk on depression for the care group in about a month's time, said that he was going to base it on Psalm 73, which actually is also very helpful. But he was now going to sort of, bring in Psalm 77 as well. Psalm 73 talks about the psalmist at the bottom of a deep pit. And as Brother Gary sort of depicted it when he actually ended up giving the talk, he said, when you're in this dark pit at the bottom, and you're completely covered in darkness, the only way and the only place you can look is up. And we know God is light and God is love. And when a human being looks up and gives up on, saving themselves, and they can only look up, the light from above actually then shows that in the rough walls that seem to be insurmountable and unclimbable, minutes before, you can see in the roughness of that pit footholes, toe holes, finger holes where you can climb. And I think it's a very apt description of really what the answer here is in the psalm. That in that pit, when we're wallowing at the time with, abject hopelessness and despair, that we sometimes failed to look up. But when faced with that, brothers and sisters, looking up is the answer, isn't it? Putting our trust in God, as Jared said, and in his prayer, talking about where do we go in those dark moments. So what do you think about when you wake in the night, perhaps in trepidation because of things that are happening in your life? Where does your mind go? I can tell you that in the past, when I tried to sort matters out myself, back in the days of anxiety, that trying to think through those things and scribble down notes to yourself on pieces of paper, etc., didn't help. But by reflecting upon God and Jesus, by reflecting upon the blessings that God has given to us in our brothers and sisters, that's the place of help. And whilst I was in the Ra resort for the week, the pain was so intense that at night, these very long nights, that I got solace. In fact, it was so real to me that I felt that God was there and there and there and there and above me, and I could almost, it might sound strange to you, I'm sorry, but I could almost hear the prayers of my brothers and sisters being spoken to God on my behalf. That's where I was. Sure, the endone helped, but at the same time, I was able to endure. Remember the quote from Paul in Corinthians? I was able to endure that. And I have at other times over these last 17 years. The lesson I'd learnt was to put trust in God. So what does verse 10 say? As I said to you, it's quite obscure. We read it, "And I said, this is my infirmity, but I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High." Had God really been shut up like in the mercies in verse 9? The answer was no. The word infirmity there, if you're taking notes, is the Hebrew word kolor. I don't know whether I've got the pronunciation right, but and it actually means, as I say, it's an unusual word. It's a primitive root that means to be worn or rubbed. Therefore, it has the idea of weak or sick, grieved. It's even used in travail in birth. So it's talking about like this weakness or this pain, this hurt. But it has in its meaning also the idea of being entreated or pleading. And it's used that way in Daniel chapter 9, verse 13. Now, I'm not asking you to go across to there, but because of time, but that's the prayer of Daniel. Okay? And this, I may be wrong here, but I sort of feel that prayer that's expressed in its entirety in Daniel chapter 9 may well have been the prayer that got him thrown into the den of lions. That he refused to give up the prayer to God to forgive him and to forgive his people and to send them back home to Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he prayed for that until his enemies, of course, accused him to the king and he was thrown into the den of lions. But what was his prayer in the den of lions? And we're not told. But whilst he was there, I'm sure it was the same sort of thing that we're considering. But in that word, it's used in that context. This is what it actually means. The Hebrew word, this kolor, means, that's translated here infirmity. It actually, this is the extended meaning. It's the little child who touches the face of a parent in a desire to receive answers. I'm sure nearly everybody in the room will have seen that. The child perhaps in tears. Maybe they've been rebuked by mother or father. Okay? And it's the little child who almost can't express their sorrow for what's happened, and they reach up and touch the face of their parent. That's the meaning of the word in its totality. So he says, this is my position. This is where I am. It's almost like he's saying, I know that God is saying here, I know you don't understand. As the parent, you must trust me. I know what's best for you. And if we think of God in our dark times and periods, if we think of God like that, as a father who's there, and we look up and he's shining upon us, and we feel that even though we feel like our life is being ripped apart, our soul, our spirit. So if I can then paraphrase this, it's like the psalmist saying, I realised that my despair was my weakness. And in reality, brothers and sisters, beginning of last year I was at the School of Prophets actually with Steve, and he was doing fantastic talks on Nehemiah, and I was leading the boys through some workshops on the theme of joy. Maybe the pain was meant to test my studies again, taking it from the academic into the practical. But the conclusion that we came to in looking at that particular subject was that you can be joyous when you're sad. You can be full of joy when you are in the pit. Because the opposite of sadness is happiness, isn't it? And both of those situations, happiness and sadness, are just relative to what you're going through at the moment. They're temporary things. But the hope that God gives us in and through his Son that we've come to remember today gives us incredible joy that can't be taken away. It can be tested, but it can't be taken away. And that's what can remain with us through these difficulties. And so the thinking process here of this psalmist, led him through to understand that where he was at that particular moment when he was asking those questions in verses 7 to 9 was in a spiritually debilitating state, and that needed to be corrected. He needed to endure what he was going through. And God understands, and Jesus of course understands, that we're talking about that which is natural to us. Remember what Paul said? It's common to us to fall into these times of difficulty, the pits of our life. It's a natural thing to spiral out of control. But of course, spiritually we know it's unhelpful. And it robbed the psalmist of seeing that God was there. It robbed him of seeing that God was doing things for him. And hence, when he realised that, like Psalm 23, that on that rocky road through the shadow of the valley of the shadow of death, that God was with him through all of those circumstances. And as he obviously, like Brother Gary's point was, as he lifted his eyes, the perspective came to him and he could endure whatever was thrown at him. And he therefore then meditated. Can you see that? Verse 11, I will remember the works of Yahweh. It's interesting that verse 11 and 12 is in the future tense, isn't it? So I think this is the very moment of the turning point here. And he's almost exhorting himself. Okay? I can see the light, he's almost saying, and I can feel the love. And God's gone nowhere. He's always been there. And I will remember the works of Yahweh. Surely I will remember thy wonders of old. I will meditate also of all thy work and talk of thy doings. See, he's going to share it. That's why the psalm has been written for us. He's going to share it. And I think it's our responsibility, brothers and sisters. You know, Steve exhorted the sisters to reach out to Sister Marilyn. And you go, it is our responsibility, but it's also our great joy that we can actually do that and help our brothers and sisters. And I mean it when I say that I could almost hear those prayers. It was a reality. And it was helpful. God had done great wonders, as the psalm finishes up, hadn't he? And he has done great wonders in Israel. They are his witnesses. We believe that he brought them through the Red Sea. He delivered them through the storms of life. God was always in control. We might just leave the psalm there. Can you come across to the Lamentations of Jeremiah? Chapter 3. I don't have to tell you that Lamentations is a bit of a morbid book, isn't it? Do you enjoy reading it when it comes time for the daily readings? Well, there's a lot in here actually to learn about, of course, but it's very consistent with what we're talking about. But in the middle of this, pretty real but depressing book, in verse 19 we read these words: remembering mine affliction and my misery, the wormwood and the gall, my soul hath them still in remembrance and is humbled in me. This I recall. And the word there, Rotherham translates it, to bring back to my heart. This brings back to my heart, to my mind. Therefore I have hope. It is of Yahweh's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. And this whole thing that we've been discussing today, brothers and sisters, is played out. We've come here to remember God and his beloved Son. And it was played out in his life, wasn't it? I don't want you to go across there, but we know the issues and the situation around the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus in his own pit. Jesus, knowing exactly what was going to happen, was going through the agonies of a human being. All ye shall be offended because of me this night. And where did he go? He took his disciples into the garden where he was wont to pray, because he was lifting his eyes to his Father. That was the only place he could go, brothers and sisters, young people. And expressed these words: my soul is exceeding sorrowful unto death. Tarry ye here, he said to 3 disciples, and watch. Have you ever asked yourself the question, brothers and sisters, what did he mean tarry here and watch. Watch what? Were they standing guard for the coming of the soldiers with the betrayer at the fore? No. Jesus knew that was later. Brothers and sisters, he was giving to them the greatest gift that he could. That was, he was going to model to them where you go when you're facing your greatest trial. He was going to show that to them. A godly man enduring the storms of the soul and ultimately surrendering to his Father because his Father knew best. Watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation, Jesus said, because the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And as he prayed to his Father, he was not overcome, was he? In the sense that he gave up, even though he asked those words, Father, if it be possible, remove this cup. But of course, and we can be so very grateful that he bowed his knees to his God and Father, surrendered his will, and in that sense was victorious over those things which we feel common to us. As the Son endured the suffering and the shame of the cross, the cup that he had to drink, the Father, Abba, was watching as well. And it was then his turn to show his emotion, wasn't it? The clouds rolled in, the world became black. God shook the earth as his beloved Son committed his soul to his Father and closed his eyes in sleep. So the psalmist that we've considered this morning, brothers and sisters, lived out and then recorded the answer to his despair. But the Lord that we come to remember this morning showed how hope can quiet the inner storms. So God has, in his word, has already answered all our prayers before they're even asked. He knows what we're going through, what we have gone through. Sometimes when we look at each other, and knowing the storms of life that have happened, sometimes I'm sure that if you're like me, we shake our head in admiration of the faith and the hope of our brothers and sisters. We wonder, how can they even stand on their feet, let alone walk through the doors, and realise that they do that because they look up. And at times of crisis, they've relied and trusted upon their Lord. In those 17 years, it's been full of great joys and also incredible sadness. I watched my brother and sister-in-law lose 4 members in a plane crash, brother and sister-in-law, and 2 of their children. I've watched my brother and sister-in-law lose a daughter after 10 years battling a brain tumour, and watched them stand upright in faith as they buried their son-in-law. And I was encouraged. And I realised that the psalm was something that they lived, because they walk in the footsteps of their Lord, and they trust in him. I'm hoping today, brothers and sisters, that what we've considered may be of help now, and maybe in those days that are left to us. Because as the hymn that we sang finishes up, God never yet forsook in need the man that trusted him indeed.